6:30 next Sunday.
Since the modern town of Akhisar is on the site, little archaeological excavation has been done, and as a result, we know less about Thyatira than many of the other cities. Now, it was founded in the 3rd century BC as a military outpost by the Greeks, and remained a military outpost into the time of the early church. Here's a picture I took of the big red basilica, which is kind of the biggest remaining structure that is there. And the city wasn't insignificant. Scholars used to say that it was. We now think otherwise. Its connections to the military meant that it was a natural cultivation ground for trade guilds, and trade guilds are going to become an important part of the conversation. A trade guild was a union of trading partners, and the guilds were stratified and competitive with the most successful businessmen placed in the higher strata. An entrepreneur would aspire to climb the hierarchy into the guilds that consisted of better connected trading partners with whom they could do business. And these guilds spanned many facets of the empire's economy. Now, more guilds are known in Thyatira than any other city. They had wool workers, linen workers, makers of outer garments, dyers, leather workers, tanners, potters, bakers, slave dealers. We'll get a sense of how John feels about slavery when we get to Revelation chapter 18, but we know that Thyatira was a major center for slave trade. And remember Acts chapter 16, Paul's first convert in Europe is a woman named Lydia, who's from the city of Thyatira. And remember, she's a seller of purple goods, so a person of some means. Now, this is interesting right here. Temples in the ancient Roman period often incorporated an element of ventriloquism, where the idol would be floor level, and then there would be a subterranean level where the pagan priest would go down, and he would speak through this pipe connected to the idol to make it seem as though this idol was the voice of the god speaking to the people. And people were deceived by this. And that's what this is here at Thyatira. Probably the coolest thing there. Here's Danielle after you go down where the priest would be, and there's the hole that leads up to connect them.
Tight.
Kind of like the Wizard of Oz.
It's the Wizard of Oz. That's the analogy I needed. You might be late, but at least you have good insights. Yeah, and some folks think this is what's going on in Revelation 13. If they want a historical approach to the situation in Revelation 13, where it says that life was given to the image of the beast so that he could speak, some folks not opting for like a supernatural interpretation say, well, maybe that's what that's referring to as a kind of ventriloquism. We can discuss that more when we get there. The words of the Son of God, who has eyes like a flame of fire and whose feet are like burnished bronze. Remember that the aspect of Jesus' appearance that shows up in a message to a particular church has some sort of connection to the message to that particular church. Now, why does it call him the Son of God here? Some folks think that this has to do with the importance of Apollo in Thyatira, because Apollo was the son of Zeus, right? The son of the head god of the pantheon. This could be the case. It could be a polemic against the worship of Apollo. I don't see any evidence for that in context especially, but if you lived at Thyatira, this would make sense. Now, the eyes of fire represent Christ's ability to penetrate and see through the deceptive teachings of Jezebel at Thyatira. And we will see other places in Revelation where when heavenly figures, where their eyes are emphasized, it's to let us know that they see the things that take place on earth. In this case, Jesus sees through these false teachings. He sees the motives of the heart. And whose feet are like burnished bronze. The last time I taught Revelation, I thought it was sufficient to say this right here. The background for the feet of bronze is the city's military connection. His feet represent his strength to execute justice against what his eyes have seen in the church. But based on the conversation we had when we were in Revelation chapter 1, I don't think that's a sufficient explanation anymore. we were able to trace Jesus' feet of bronze back to Daniel chapter 10, where this was the characteristic of an angel. And now we have to ask ourselves, why would the angelic feet of Jesus be emphasized, especially to the church at Thyatira? Well, there are a number of connection points between that text in Daniel 10 and the message at Thyatira. Now, you'll remember that Daniel 10 is a passage where the angel with the feet like bronze has been fighting fallen angels. Remember, the nation of Persia is headed up by a fallen angel, and the nation of Greece is headed up by a fallen angel, and those angels were fighting against God's angel. Well, here Jesus has the characteristics of that angel, and he's calling out the deep things of Satan. There's going to be this discussion about a morning star, and so the context is one of spiritual warfare against the fallen angels, just like in Daniel 10. Psalm 2 is the background for Jesus being called the Son of God. We'll talk more about Psalm 2 in a moment. But that passage grants the Son of David authority over all the nations. And so there seems to be a contrast or a conflict here with the angelic sons of God who rule over the nations. And of course, the angelic sons of God are the angels. I won't read all these texts, but we see this title, Sons of God, used for the angels in multiple places, such as in Genesis 6, where they have an illicit union with the daughters of men, in Deuteronomy 32:8, where the nations are divided and given to these figures as their inheritance, or in Job, where a heavenly council is convened and the sons of God appear and Satan is among them. Jesus has the angelic feet here because he is the Son of God who is warring against these sons of God in the unseen realm, and their teachings, the deep things of Satan, have taken root in Thyatira. I know your works, your love and faith and service and patient endurance, and that your latter works exceed the first. Now, notice that they're on the upward tick, right? Progress. It's different from Ephesus. Ephesus was told that their first works were good, and they need to be restored to their first works. Thyatira is the opposite, that they're actually getting better over time. And this may account for why Christ threatens to remove the whole Ephesian church, but he only threatens to judge certain segments within the church at Thyatira. Perhaps the difference is that at least most of this congregation is on the upward tick. Their pattern over time is becoming more positive. Now, it's interesting that two churches with serious problems, and certainly these are not the worst churches, right? The worst churches are Sardis and Laodicea. We'll do Sardis tonight, Laodicea we'll do next time. These two churches do have serious problems, however, and they also have the most extensive list of good works. And even though these are not the worst churches, it just seems that Jesus is modeling how to correct someone. Right? When correcting someone's errors, we should always be fast to acknowledge what they've done right. And he gives both of these churches pretty strong rebukes, but at the same time, he's very careful to articulate the things that they've done well. But I have this against you, that you tolerate that woman Jezebel, almost certainly a nickname that's not what she called herself, right? This is an insult. You tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess and is teaching and seducing my servants. Now, most scholars, and I'm in agreement with them, do not think the issue is that this is a woman who is teaching, right? The issue is not her gender. The issue is the content she teaches. And in here, she's being discussed as being a false prophetess, and there are many at Thyatira who think that she's a true prophet. Now, of course, women are allowed to prophesy in 1 Corinthians 11:5. There's a woman who prophesies over baby Jesus at the beginning of his gospel. There are women who prophesy in the book of Acts. We have a female apostle in Romans 16. We have Paul in Philippians 4:2 mentioning women who labored beside him in the work of the gospel. It doesn't sound like they were washing dishes. It sounds like they were laboring beside him in the work of the gospel. We have Mary, who sits at the feet of Jesus. Many scholars think that this is a Jewish idiom for one rabbi who's training another rabbi. we have Paul, who arrests not all Christians, but leaders in the movement. And it says explicitly in the book of Acts that he arrested men and women. So it's quite unlikely that the issue with Jezebel is her gender. The issue seems to be the things that she's teaching. Why is Christ calling this person Jezebel? Well, Jezebel was the Phoenician wife of Ahab, who programmatically led the northern kingdom into Baal worship, right? So she's someone who misleads lots of people. Jezebel, at the end of her life, is tossed out of a window and is eaten by dogs. And this reveals an interesting interplay in Revelation. So this Jezebel character is a real person, but later in the book of Revelation, we're going to find the great whore, which is an economic and entertainment system. And when the great whore is destroyed, it will say that the beast and his kings hate the harlot and will make her desolate and naked and will eat her flesh and will burn her up with fire. This language of eating her flesh is Jezebel language. So we essentially have two Jezebels in the book of Revelation. We have this prophetess at Thyatira, and then we have the economic system. And this prophetess foreshadows the economic system that falls in the later portions of the book. Now, why would that be? Well, it's likely because this prophetess's teaching has something to do with bad economics, has something to do with some kind of compromising your faithfulness toward Christ for the sake of economic gain. We'll talk more about that right now. And it goes on to describe what she's doing. And seducing my servants to practice sexual immorality and to eat food sacrificed to idols. So that there are situations in which her teaching allows, maybe every situation as far as her teaching is concerned, where she allowed Christians to eat idols' food, maybe even within the context of idol worship, maybe even within the context of the idol's temple. We don't know. Most interpreters believe that Jezebel's teaching allowed Christians to participate in trade guilds. So these trade guilds, as I said before, were important if you were in business. You wanted to have good trading partners in order to make it work. Well, the issue there is that the trade guilds would meet for these dinners, and they would have patron deities, where they would pray to the gods, and they would certainly eat idols' food. And if you're a Christian, well, you can't participate in that, obviously, without a serious violation of conscience. And it appears that Jezebel's teaching somehow allowed Christians to justify participating in these trade guilds and eating the idol's food at these dinners. And that's the issue here. It looks ahead to the text in Revelation 13 that discusses the mark of the beast, that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark. Economic participation at the cost of one's faithfulness is a major crime in this book, right? The elevation of the pursuit of money above all else is a major crime in Revelation. Now, it also says that she teaches them sexual immorality. This is quite debated because there are three ways that sexual immorality is discussed in Revelation. One is literal sexual immorality. The other is idolatry. This is borrowed from the Old Testament. The prophets used to talk about going off with the idols as being a form of adultery. And then later on, sexual immorality is the language that is used for participating in the economic system that has fallen. So many scholars, I think most here, think that she isn't literally teaching Christians that they can go and have sex with whomever. But at the same time, these dinners, if she's telling them that they can eat at these dinners, there's some danger there, because we know that prostitutes were often brought in to service the men at the dinners. And we know that when rich men had these dinners, they would hire musicians, and flute girls were especially known for doubling as prostitutes. They play the flute during the dinner, and then they serve as prostitutes afterwards. So there could very well be a component here of actual sexual immorality. We're not sure. It's not just trade guilds, though. We need to keep in mind public festivals like those honoring Artemis or the emperor. You could appear antisocial for not participating in these. And they're not Western individualist culture. They are Eastern collectivist culture. If you appear antisocial in their culture, that is really, really bad. That's a terrible stigma to bear. Also family, right? You might become a Christian in this context, but your family's likely not, and they likely disapprove of Christianity. And if you're going to the family dinner and you refuse to participate and eat with your parents or your siblings the way you've always done because of the idol's food, there would be incredible pressure from the family for you to go ahead and eat this idol's food. So it's no wonder that this prophetess, this false prophetess, is coming up with some sort of doctrinal system where she's allowing people to eat idol's food. For many of them, that would have helped to save their family relationships.
Did Paul later on, did he not say eating food that was worship? Go ahead and eat food.
Yeah.
It's the act of worship that's the problem.
Yeah. So what's interesting is that liberal biblical scholars, I'm thinking of especially of Elaine Pagel at Harvard, about whom I could say much. She has, and she's just one person who's done this. There are those who think the book of Revelation is written to attack Paul and his followers, right? And the idea is that Revelation has a cutthroat attitude toward eating the idol's food, and Paul was more permissive, and so Revelation doesn't line up with Paul. And you'll find that this is, among liberal biblical scholars, this is extremely common, to try to separate one gospel from another, to separate the gospels from Paul, and to separate Revelation from everybody, and that these are all various Christianities and none of them agree. The trouble here is, and we'll actually, here in a moment, we'll talk about the issue of knowledge, but the trouble is that in Paul's case, he's dealing with people who think that because an idol is nothing, it doesn't actually matter if this food was dedicated to an idol. I can eat it just because it's food. There's nothing to it. Well, Paul does not respond permissively. Quite the contrary. What he says is one, idols may not be real gods, but they're demonic. And they have associations with the demonic realm. And what the nations are actually worshiping are demons. It's not that when you worship a false god, there's nothing on the other side. You're worshiping a demon. And then he says that the only way you could eat this food is if there's a don't ask, don't tell policy. If you don't know this food is dedicated to an idol and nobody cared to tell you, and you don't ask any questions and they don't tell you anything, then you can eat. Well, that's going to be a narrow set of circumstances. And he also says that you can't eat the food if it's going to bother any other Christian around you who doesn't have this kind of understanding. And so the parameters that Paul lays down are actually extremely narrow. And if you're at Corinth and you receive Paul's letter, you still can't eat idol's food in most circumstances, right? He's rebuking Christians who think they can eat them in basically all circumstances. So Revelation is rebuking the same sort of thing. And as where people have tried to pull Revelation and Paul apart, they're actually very similar, if not identical. The issue is we just don't have enough data on the situation at Thyatira to know if there would, under very narrow circumstances such as Paul outlines, be a situation in which it's acceptable to eat this meat. But for the most part, in most circumstances, it is clear that Paul says no. And as far as Revelation is concerned, it appears that in most circumstances, the answer is no as well. It says, I gave her time to repent, but she refuses to repent of her sexual immorality. Behold, I will throw her onto a sick bed, and those who commit adultery with her, I will throw into great tribulation unless they repent of her works. And there's kind of a play on a word here. So klein is the word for bed. So you think of recline, right? So these guys would go to these dinners and they would recline back on one side and eat with the other hand. But the word klein can also be a sick bed, and it can also be like a bed for fornication. So we see how all these nuances of the word are getting mixed together here. Gave her time to repent. Now, many interpreters think this alludes to an earlier warning she received from John or someone else to stop teaching. When this letter arrives in Thyatira and it's read to the congregation, this is not news to her. She's had this ongoing conflict with someone, and she has been told not to continue teaching this, and she's chosen to persist. This is the latest installment in that ongoing argument. And just a quick reminder of our discussion before on the word tribulation. We've all been exposed at some point to the teaching that in the book of Revelation, tribulation refers to God's wrath poured out on unbelievers at the end of history. But as we've seen, it's used 5 times all of Christians, 4 times faithful Christian suffering, 1 time for Christians who need to repent, and this is that 1 time. And I will kill her children with death. What do you mean you kill the children with death? I mean, why don't you just say, I'll kill the children? Well, it's a Semitism. In other words, if you're thinking or speaking in Hebrew, that's how you would say this. For example, in 2 Samuel 12:14, when David and Bathsheba have a child outside of a marital union, and indeed it's a bloody situation because her husband has been murdered, the child dies on the 8th day, and it uses this phrase. It's a way of saying death by pestilence or plague or famine. It likely does not refer to her actual physical children, remembering again that she is a picture of Babylon the Great from later chapters. Well, Babylon the Great is a whore, and it says that she has many daughters. So a great economic center, a great city with many other cities under her. That's her offspring. And so here, the offspring of this Jezebel is those who have accepted her teachings. And all the churches will know that I am he who searches mind and heart, and I will give to each of you according to your work. So here we see the explanation for the eyes of fire. The searching of the mind and the heart is what that means. And I'll give to each of you according to your works. I would like to desensitize us to almost the kind of anxiety that people feel when they get to a New Testament passage that says you will be repaid according to your works, or you will be judged according to your works. Right? There's always this tension. The New Testament says you're justified by faith, and then it also says you're judged according to your works. And as soon as a New Testament writer says this, you'll find that most of us within the Protestant tradition will try to quickly move on, or we'll try to downplay it, or dilute it, or my favorite, well, what he means is, and what he means is he'll repay you according to your faith, and that your works are not involved in any way. They're just kind of a secondary evidence of your faith. Well, my proposal is that we not explain what he means and mention a bunch of stuff he doesn't say. When New Testament writers want to emphasize works, just let them do it. Right? If he needed a cleanup job, he'd clean it up himself. He's obviously comfortable talking about works. And so let's just desensitize to this, let it happen several times. There are later junctures in the book at which we will explore the relationship between grace and faith and works and all these things. After all, the great white throne judgment where everyone was judged according to their works, right? That's in this book. So. But to the rest of you in Thyatira, who do not hold this teaching, who have not learned what some call the deep things of Satan, to you I say, I do not lay on you any other burden, only hold fast what you have until I come. Do they actually call their teaching the deep things of Satan? This is difficult to imagine, and it's even more difficult to imagine how something like that would work. I mean, would you say that the deep things of Satan means that you must become acquainted with evil if you want to defeat it? You must put yourself in demonic atmospheres where people are dedicating food to idols, and you outwardly participate while maintaining this kind of inward discipline and allegiance toward Jesus. It's difficult to imagine how this would work, and most scholars don't go that route. Instead, most scholars think this is a parody. Jezebel and her friends call their teaching the deep things of God, and Jesus disagrees and says these are not the deep things of God, these are the deep things of Satan. And the reason that makes sense is because earlier in this chapter, when we're talking about the Jewish antagonists at Smyrna, it says they're not really Jews, but they are a synagogue of Satan. Well, they didn't call themselves the synagogue of Satan. They called themselves the synagogue of God. And so here, these Christians likely refer to their teaching as the deep things of God. And again, Jesus has said, no, it's the deep things of Satan. And our only analogy for this, again, is that passage in 1 Corinthians. Paul even uses this phrase, the deep things of God. And he moves on to correct those who think that they have such depth of knowledge that they can eat idols' food in any situation. So that is like what they have. They have a teaching on the deep things of God. And after you get into the minutia of whatever their doctrinal system is, they think they can eat the idol's food, and Jesus isn't buying it. When we were in Texas, we had a ministry. We participated in a ministry. It wasn't ours, where we would take various people who were coming there to go to school. Many of them were Hindus, and the agreement was they could drive our cars, and we'd teach them how to drive and help them get a license. They just had to come to our Bible study. And it was, it sounds transactional, but people in the Eastern world don't care. They're just happy that somebody will help them get a license, right? So they did it. And one time I went with them to the Hindu temple. Danielle and I both went, and I was just there as an observer. And it was a particular festival. And after they had their worship and their music, they had the idols food. And the students, wanted to show me some appreciation. So they go and they get the idols food and they bring it to me, and they're explaining, they're like, this food is always good, but it's even better after it's been dedicated to whatever the god was, I can't remember. And I had to explain to them that I couldn't eat it. And they're like, well, why can't you eat it, right? Because it just seems like very unhospitable to refuse their food. And I said, I think all of these deities are actually there, and I think they are real, but I don't think they have humanity's best interest in mind. And this is what's revealed in the New Testament. And as a consequence, I can't eat this food. Now, the pressure placed on me was small, right, in comparison to people who'd be getting pressured by their families and their businesses and all these things. But, you read about eating idols food in the 21st century, and you think, well, I'll never be in that situation. And we look for all these analogies. But yeah, it was weird to actually be in that situation where I had to say no idols food for me. The one who conquers and who keeps my works until the end, to him I will give authority over the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron, as when earthen pots are broken in pieces, even as I myself have received authority from my Father, and I will give him the morning star. This is inspired by Psalm 2, one of the most quoted messianic texts in the Bible. I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son, today I've begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. And then this part is also borrowed by our text in Revelation. You shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. This is a promise made to David's son, to the Messiah. And what's interesting about Revelation is promises made to individuals in the Old Testament get democratized, right? So it's the son of David who will shatter them like pottery. Now Revelation saying it's all of us, right? We are all Davids in Revelation. We'll also find later that we are all high priests, that very unique promises made to specific individuals in the Old Testament. Revelation has a way of democratizing those for the whole church. Earthen pots were often inscribed with the names of a nation's enemies and then ritually smashed to symbolize the future victory of the king. The imagery is that of total destruction. This depicts the absolute devastation of hostile nations by the Messiah and his people. So if you're into magic and you would like to curse my home state of Texas, you would take Texas pottery and you'd get a big iron rod and you would smash it, right? Just do it at a distance, not on their lawn. They have lots of guns. And I will give him the morning star. The morning star, of course, is a reference to the planet Venus. So what is Jesus talking about? Well, it's interesting that morning star language comes from Isaiah 14. And Isaiah 14 is about the fall of the king of Babylon. And as we've been discussing, kings and nation states have a corresponding reality in the angelic realm. And Old Testament scholars will tell us that the fall of the king of Babylon here is not his alone, that his story is being compared to a member of the heavenly council who has fallen. I'll just read it. Maggots are spread out as your bed beneath you, and worms are your covering. How you have fallen from heaven, O morning star, son of the dawn. You have been cut down to the earth. You have weakened the nations. In Christian tradition, this has been used as a passage about the devil, and we will find in Revelation and other texts like the book of Enoch that falling stars are representative of fallen angels. But Jesus says, I will give him the morning star. Well, what's going on here? Well, in Revelation 22:16, Jesus says he is the bright morning star. And I think that what is happening here is Jesus shows up at the church of Thyatira message. He has the feet like an angel, right? Because he's going to replace angelic authorities. In fact, we see this in Revelation 12. As soon as he goes up, Satan goes down, right? He kicks him out. And if Satan was the morning star who fell, then Jesus has become the bright morning star who replaces him. And the reason why Jesus says, I will give you the bright morning star, is it's a way of saying he will give us himself. In the Old Testament, there's something called the Levitical inheritance motif. And that's just a fancy way of saying that the priests were not given a land inheritance. They were told God would be their inheritance. And so this seems to be priesthood language. Revelation is very concerned with describing Christians in the role of priests. And so when Jesus says he's going to give us himself as an inheritance, that he will give us the bright morning star, and he is the bright morning star, it's a very personal way of describing the priesthood status of Christians. Two bad actors. So in our last church, Pergamum, we saw Balaam mentioned, and now we just had Jezebel. Jezebel and Balaam are the only Old Testament villains mentioned by name in the address to the seven churches. Well, what's going on with that? Well, the key is to think about who are their arch enemies. The arch enemy of Balaam was Moses. The arch enemy of Jezebel was Elijah. Moses and Elijah are the two most famous prophets from the Old Testament. And this is interesting because in a later text, Moses and Elijah show up, right? In the passage of the two witnesses, it says, these have the power to shut up the sky so that rain will not fall during the days of their prophesying. That's what Elijah did when he was facing off with Jezebel. And they have power over the waters to turn them into blood. You don't need any explanation there. That's the first of 10 signs that Moses performed in the land of Egypt. Now, when we get to the two witnesses, we will have to ask the question, are these two individual prophets running around like superheroes doing these things? Or do these two witnesses represent the church and its power to bring plagues on the empire? And when we have that conversation, we will want to remember the address to the seven churches, right? Because Elijah and Jezebel are against Moses and Elijah. Did I say that right?
I think you said.
I said it the wrong way. Okay, yeah. So Jezebel and Balaam are against Elijah and Moses. Well, who are Jezebel and Balaam against at the beginning of this book? Well, the churches, right? So when we meet Elijah and Moses, well, who are they going to represent? Likely the churches. And there will be lots of other ways to approach that, to approach the identity of the two witnesses. We have lots of other things to help us, not the least of which is we were told in Revelation 1:20 that lampstands represent the churches. Well, what are the two witnesses going to be called in Revelation 11? Lampstands. Last thing to say is the churches have a 3+4 structure. The rest of the book tends to have a 4+3 structure. So for the first three churches, Christ says, hear the Spirit, and then he makes a promise. For the last four churches, he makes a promise, then he says, hear the Spirit. And then we get to the plagues, and it's the other way. The first four are a group, like the four horsemen, for example. And then the three that follow are a group. Well, why is it 3+4 with the churches and 4+3 with the plagues? Well, I think that it has to do with the notion of creation and new creation. The plagues are going to be replays of the 7 days of creation. As the world was made in 7 steps, it will be torn down in 7 steps. Well, the creation week has a 4+3 structure. That's why the plagues have a 4+3 structure. But the churches have a 3+4 structure. Why? Because it's the opposite. That is new creation. The plagues is God tearing down old creation. The church is the beginning of new creation that will continue into eternity, and that is likely why the structures are reversed. Okay, so Thyatira, as I said, is pretty extensive. Our next one is Sardis, which is, I think, much shorter. But before I just jump into that, I feel like this was a lot of information. Do we need to process this, question, comments, etc., before we go to Sardis?
I do have one question. My husband is not a fan of the message, but the 7 repeating, hear the Spirit, promise made, and then you're saying promise made, hear the Spirit. It says so I'll just read it in the Amplified here. He who has an ear, let him hear and heed what the Spirit says to the churches, and 7 times through 1st, 2nd, and 3rd chapters of Revelation. Well, the Message puts it, are your ears awake? Listen to the wind words, the Spirit moving through the churches. And I just think there's something about that. I don't know, it sounds like Jesus to me. So is that what you would call a paraphrase? That's my husband calls the Message a paraphrase. He's not learned like you, Justin, but he wanted me to ask this question.
Yeah, I think that's the first time anyone's ever called me learned, so I'll start there. I'll never get used to that. I would say, yeah. So our translations are on a spectrum, and they're usually divided into 3 categories. A formal equivalence version tries to, as best as it can, to be very literal and to even, where it can, sustain word order from the Greek or Hebrew into English. That's not always possible, but good examples would be the New American Standard Bible, the English Standard Version, the King James Version also, but there are other problems there. And then kind of the middle ground is the dynamic equivalence version. It's very much a translation, but they actually try to make it sound good in English, so like the NIV. And then, yes, what you're talking about is a paraphrase translation. The message is a paraphrase based on the King James Bible. So it does have some difficulties, as where the Living Bible is a paraphrase that is based on the Hebrew and Greek text. But nevertheless, paraphrase versions, we find that these are common in the time of the ancient church, and ancient worshipers like them. I like them. And they were used to instruct people. You go to the synagogue, they had a set of paraphrases called the Memra. And so, in principle, I don't have anything against paraphrase versions. I think the one you just read brings it out beautifully, just as long as we recognize that that is a paraphrase and that it's not, word for word.
So back to the food, worship the idols, and what I struggle with, and we don't have to go down a big rabbit hole here, but you chose not to eat that food, and was that because of well, first of all, for me, just walking in there and being in the service would be but eating the food, even though your heart is with Jesus, versus eating the food and giving an implicit consent, acknowledgement of their gods, versus taking a stand. And I feel like as an evangelical Christian, to be called to worship the people that aren't worshiping the same God I am, but yet call themselves Christians, I get the creeps. I don't want to worship with them because I don't know what they're calling God. And what does that do to my witness? Am I legalistic? Am I alienating myself from getting closer to them so that I can witness to them? It's just a struggle. And in your heart, if God knows, Jesus knows, you don't worship these folks or they're gods, but you break bread with them to draw closer into fellowship so you can continue witnessing. Did you choose not to eat because, why did you choose not to eat?
I chose not to eat because I wanted to use it as an evangelism opportunity.
Okay.
Yeah, I was trying to witness to them. It's very difficult, especially with Hindus, right? Because as where we might be all-inclusive and postmodern in the West, they're sort of that way since the ancient times. And saying that they would be okay with you inviting them to worship Jesus alongside 20,000 other gods.
Right.
But when you start saying, don't worship this, but worship this is where they get offended. And it becomes difficult to find powerful moments in which you can say, because I've said yes to Jesus, I must say no to some other things. And this became that type of a witnessing opportunity for me.
Did you know that was coming?
I didn't know it was coming.
Oh.
I'd never been to a Hindu temple. I would assume if somebody just asked me, is there going to be idols food at a festival? I'd be like, oh, that makes sense. But I didn't think about it until it just happened,
The whole reason for us to go to his church is because we were trying to get him to come to our church.
Yeah, right.
That's right.
And
We were cracking
he
a
said,
deal. Yeah.
he was like, oh, I'll go to your church from our church. And so we came to his church and we sat there and listened, but we didn't participate in anything.
How was the relationship after that?
It was fine.
We ended up going to
It
his
was fine.
graduation,
They kind of went quiet. This particular guy, we went to his graduation. We talked to them some. He and I are friends on Facebook. My account's suspended most of the time, but sometimes I interact with him when I have the account. Indians are notoriously difficult to convert.
Yeah.
That's why it's been so interesting to me when I got to Trinity. Every time I ran into an Indian Christian, because I'd worked on so many Indian Christians unsuccessfully, I was like, "You're an Indian Christian," and I'd get excited, and they'd be looking at me like, "Yeah, so what?"
Can I ask you a question?